work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it, work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it, stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it, heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
All right, hey, peace. Thanks for tuning in to the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast. I am absolutely thrilled today to be joined by three organizers with Housing Equity Now St. Paul, in my opinion, like the real all-stars of the 2021 election season in Minnesota. We're talking about a campaign that won one of the strongest rent control policies in the country, a huge victory for the people of St. Paul, and a real shining example, not only for us in Minneapolis and for renters across the state, but I think for renters and for working class people around the country. It was a really historic victory. So I want to welcome you all and ask if you could just take turns introducing yourself and saying a little bit about the role that you played in this campaign.
I can go ahead. Hi, everyone. My name is B. I use they and them pronouns. I don't know. I feel like I had multiple hands and multiple buckets when I was doing the campaign, which I was very happy to do. But yeah, I think I was part of the steering committee, as part of the comms committee, and I was part of the ground game committee. So I was able to lend some support in all capacities, I think. So yeah.
Awesome. Pleasure to have you on the show.
And I'm Monica Bravo. I'm with the West Side Community Organization in St. Paul, and I'm currently the director here. And we've been involved in dreaming about this vision for a long time. So we've been at the table from the beginning, part of the steering committee, and also part of the ground game and the comms game. So like B, have our hands in all of it.
Right on. Welcome. Thank you.
Hey everyone, my name's Tram Hoang. I use she, her pronouns, and I was the campaign manager for the Keep St. Paul Home campaign.
Right on. Well, welcome to you all. I just have to really salute you all. It was such an inspiring campaign to watch, and definitely the first results I was looking for when I was looking at the election day results, and I was just super happy to see that y'all won. Very inspiring. The first question I got for you all is around the actual concrete policy that you all put up on the ballot. A lot has been made of this policy. You have, champions of rent control really celebrating how strong and universal this policy is. And you have landlords and market-oriented people kind of pearl clutching, saying that it's too universal, it's too strong, And I think I've been working on rent control in Minneapolis for many years and, have really learned how important it is that we have a strong rent control policy that doesn't have any loopholes. So I was curious if you could kind of tell our listeners what's in the St. Paul rent control policy, and then how did you all make the choice to come with a strong rent control policy? I'm sure there was a lot of pressure to move something that was more watered down, move something that was more conciliatory towards landlords. So could you kind of talk about what's in the policy and how did you come to that bold decision to move this really strong policy for renters?
Yeah, I can definitely speak to that. I think when we started having conversations, we decided that, we don't have to go through city council to win this policy. We're taking it to the ballot, which means all we need is people power to win this. And because of that, we felt like we did not have to negotiate. We didn't have to start from a place of negotiation or watering down. The battle was going to be hard anyways, so you might as well fight for what you want, right?
Hell
and it's going to be, especially when we look at who council currently is, it would be so much harder to ask them to strengthen it because we already know they're going to want to water it down. There are already talks about that. But to talk more specifically about our policy, what we have is universal coverage. So a 3% annual cap on rent increases for all rental units. So you're not going to exempt single family homes. You're not going to exempt, LIHTC, tax credit buildings, anything like that. It covers all units. And I think what I really love about our policy is that the policy covers someone even after someone moves out of a unit. So for folks who are newer to, these policy conversations, that's called vacancy decontrol, right? Which is the idea that if someone moves out of a unit, the landlord can then reset the rent wherever they want. And we know that's actually really problematic because that just creates an incentive for the landlord to evict you so that they can reset the rent. So we wanted to make sure that we have the protections of rent stabilization or rent control throughout like shifts in tenant occupancy. And then the other piece that we think is really important is that we are not exempting new construction, because we believe that everyone, whether you live in an old building or you live in a building that just got built, deserves to be protected. And for some reason, people want to believe that new buildings need to be, like, for people who live in new buildings, they should be subject to egregious rent increases. It just doesn't make any sense. We know that, the data shows that new exemptions, or that the data shows that new construction isn't actually inhibited by rent stabilization, because there is still money to be made. And wherever there's money to be made, a developer is going to build. They might take a few months to look at their numbers and adjust and be like, okay, how do I, change my formulas or whatever to make it work? But 3% annual increase is still a lot of money.
Yeah.
When you add up, like, how many units you have, how much extra money you get a month, multiply that, it can be tens of thousands of dollars for every building.
Certainly. Thank you. Do y'all got anything you want to add to that? Okay, great. And I just want to affirm, because we're going to get into these battles in Minneapolis right now, and the real key difference is that the pathway that was taken in Minneapolis, it does depend on the city council. And that's really, really unfortunate. And I think what you all proved is that the average renter, the average working class person is much more clear in their politics than the average city councilor who's influenced by developers, who oftentimes comes from a different class background. So for you all to put your faith in the people of St. Paul and for that to pay off, that just gives us so much courage and strength. And for you to articulate why that universal rent control policy is so important, I just really appreciate that. Now I wanted to move to talking a little bit about your success. I'd like to hear a little bit from you all about why do you think you won? What was key to this campaign? What do you think pushed it over the edge for you? Why did you all win? What was your strategy? How did it play out? And how did you end up turning out renters to make this possible?
I will say that I think messaging had a lot to do with it. I think when you talk about such strong policies like the one we were proposing, sometimes it could be scary to a lot of folks, especially folks who aren't familiar with these type of like policy languages and these type of policies as a whole. So I think messaging, we weren't trying to really message to rich white folk, right? We were trying to message to the average working class person who's scared about their rent going up, who's scared about what's happening to their communities that's being like destabilized. So, when I think we really took the time to also name the campaign, and I think we were like, keep St. Paul home is just, it fits, and it's such a strong statement of like, we want to make sure that people can keep St. Paul their home and make sure that they can grow here and continue to grow their generations here. So I think messaging had a lot to do with it at the start as well. But I also think huge, large people like Wesco, like they really threw down. I think Wesco threw down, DSA threw down a lot. Isaiah, through the second phase of our campaign, really threw down. So I think a large part of the successes was, these folks mobilizing their base and really mobilizing the folks that are true to them. So I think, big hitters like them, I will give major props to. And I think I will always, be so thankful for all the work that they did over there. They threw down so hard for us, and I would always be grateful. And, to the volunteers as well, volunteers who showed up, they were ready. Some of them were like, I've never door knocked a day in my life, but I care about this. And I was like, that means the world to me that you put so much faith into this campaign to be like, I'm going to go door knock strangers' doors. And I've never done that, but I really care. So I think people seeing the vision and really appreciating it, and so much that they will, be first time door knockers. I think, it's all those things in one kind of really helped us win, I think.
Awesome. Yeah.
I would say the ground game was powerful and strong, and you will not win it without a ground game, right? And being on those doors, having those conversations on the phone, that's, so much money was poured into this, right? We saw millions of dollars, and the mailers, I received a mailer every single day, large mass mailers, right? And then we were out on the doors and we would see lit drops where they, just hang something on the door, and I would, knock, and it's like, so can I talk to you about this piece of lit you have here? And it was the opposition lit, right?
Right.
And they were like, oh, they didn't knock and talk to me. Right? Because you have to interact, you have to talk to the people. And I think that was, a big part of this victory is that it's not going to come from electeds who think they know more or, have the data. It's going to come from the people. But you have to talk with the people who are most directly affected. And, we hit every single high density public housing site.
Yeah.
We hit every single, rental building, because if you're not talking to the people who are most directly affected, but if we can organize in that way, we're going to be so powerful. And 50% of our community are renters, 50% of the city of St. Paul are renters. So harness the power of the people, and that's where we can make these changes. The other thing I would say, and I think I haven't shared this with B or Tram yet, but I mean, it's just a part of, I think my character is like, so in our area, we did 2-to-1. All 4 precincts voted yes for rent stabilization.
Hell yeah.
But we could have, I think, done more in our area. And the thought about that just makes me think that we really have an opportunity to send a message to the administration that says the people, there's no way you're going to mess with this. There's no way you're going to change it. And so I think if I have like one small regret is that we in my area, I feel like we could have did just a little bit more, but we still had 80% of the entire ward. So
wow, spoken like a true organizer right there. Always looking for what's next. I just want to say, like, you often hear in politics that organized people beats organized money. And oftentimes it can come off kind of like a trite slogan, you know what I'm saying? Or like, do you wonder, is that really true? But what you're saying is y'all really proved that. Like, I was hearing astronomical numbers spent by the landlord lobby to beat you all. You're saying these big glossy mailers. But just to affirm what you're saying, to go out there, to knock on the doors, to actually talk to people, that's how we change things. So again, just like huge salute to you all. That's really incredible. And I'm thinking about what a transformational experience it must have been like for somebody whose first time it was to go knock on a door and they're connecting with renters, and then to be a part of a victory. That's going to change the trajectory of someone's whole life. That's something people will never forget. That's incredible. Tram, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I really want to echo what B and Monica said about ground game and messaging. One of the things that we kind of committed to one another when we entered the ballot initiative phase of the campaign after we had collected all the signatures was, a lot of times when it comes to the polls, people want to cater their messaging to the voters who more consistently come out to vote, right? And that's white folks, that's homeowners, higher income earners. And I think we stayed really true to ourselves and said, look, some campaigns may cater to that base, but that's not how we're going to win rent stabilization in St. Paul. And so our messaging, right, it was always focused on the actual people of St. Paul, the renters. If you look at our campaign lit, it's like the people that you would recognize, right? It's Danielle and Soleil and the baby. And so it's people that you would look at and be like, oh yeah, that's my neighbor. That's that community leader. And we really stayed true to that. And I think you can see it in the election night results because we won 6 out of the 7 wards. And the one ward that we lost was Highland Park, Ward 3. It's where, you would kind of expect an issue like this to lose because there's just not that race and class solidarity that exists. And so I think, our efforts really prove that you don't have to cater to that base of voters. Elected officials might when they're trying to run a citywide campaign, but you have to focus on the people who are most deeply impacted by this issue. They're the ones that have the motivation to come out to vote for this.
I love that. I really hope listeners are taking that in. Because that wasn't the way things went in Minneapolis. And I don't want to get too much into comparing the two campaigns, but you're not going to sell rent control by catering to small landlords and catering to white homeowners. It's like there's such a energy and appetite amongst renters. You know what I'm saying? This message just connects with people. I was door knocking and people were so lit up about rent control. So the fact that y'all stuck to your guns like that, that's just a huge example for us to follow. I'm wondering, do y'all have any like big moments that stand out to you in your work over these last couple months? Is there any like conversations you had with people or moments in the campaign that really, when you look back at this, you know, stick out to you or fill your heart, anything like that?
I will say that I think two of mine were like on the ground. And I mean, for context, we were door knocking and collecting signatures in the cold and the heat wave. And so this was during the heat wave this summer, where a lovely woman, like she had so many questions, and I think we talked for 30 minutes on her porch. And
Wow.
she was like, no one's ever really, she's like, I've had many door knockers and no one's really sat down on my porch to kind of talk to me about this stuff. She's
Wow.
like, I've never really heard about what rent stabilization is. I don't even know where to begin to ask you questions. So I think that was a really standout moment, because I'm like, oh my God, it is scorching hot, and I would love to come into your air conditioned porch. So it was a good opportunity for me. But then we were able to talk, and she was confused because she had read, misinformation and everything else like that. So it was good to kind of clear that up for her. But also my colleague Sameas, just shout out to Sameas, she also did the same thing with a similar woman who was a strong no. She was just like, I'm not for this, I don't want to do it. But Sameas was like, well, let's talk about it. Why are you against this? Why, like, let's have a conversation. I think we're both adults. Let's talk about it in a formal way. And so she talked to her, I think, for like a good 30 minutes. And then I think the next weekend, the same woman came to a signature collection site and signed our petition. And
Wow.
and I remember Samaya going, oh, I recognize you. We talked when we were door knocking. She's like, yeah. She's like, you good. You make good points. And I really just want to, at least I could just sign this. She's like, that's the least I could do. She's like, I might not be 100% on board. She's like, but I can at least put my name down on this and give people the chance to vote on it. And so, it's moments like those where it's like, yes, sometimes it's really hard to, talk to folks for a super long time, especially in extreme weather conditions that we went through. But I think it's worth it at the end. And I mean, like I said, she was able to change her mind with just one conversation. And it's like, if we have more of those, and we proved that too, right? Where it's like, if we have these long conversations, we can continue to change people's minds and their narrative, and at least get them somewhat on board, right? So I think those were two really big standout moments that I will honestly never forget.
Okay, so now I want to shift to, we talk about the successes, and I know you already have this mentality as there's always something to learn. I'm wondering, like, can you talk about the challenges that you faced in this campaign? Like, what were some moments that maybe shook your confidence, or what were the big challenges? And then how did you overcome them? And what are some of the lessons that you're pulling out of this campaign, both, as a collective and individually as organizers?
I can start. I mean, I think there are a few that stand out to me in terms of challenges as campaign manager. I think one of them is fundraising. It is hard to raise money for a ballot initiative. And it is also hard to raise money for a ballot initiative in a year where there are so many important ballot initiatives up at the ballot in both Minneapolis and St. Paul. I think, I was pretty upfront about asking foundations and partners for money. Many of them did step up, right? Because we were able to spend as much as we needed to beat the opposition. But there was a moment there where I was like, no one is responding to this. And so many groups are like, oh, we do affordable housing work. We care about housing. We care about racial justice. And our whole message with this campaign is that housing justice is racial justice. And we're not talking about building new affordable housing. We're talking about keeping the houses that people are living in now affordable to them. And it was incredibly hard to get people to step up with money. I will say, like, organizations, Take Action Isaiah, Wesco, like, there are members of our steering committee and members of our really core campaign team that did step up. But outside of that, it was hard to find the support financially to run this campaign. And that's something I think everyone's going to have to face, is that you really figure out where people's priorities are when they decide whether or not to invest in your work. I think another challenge that, we weren't too surprised by, but was just a thorn in our side day after day, was white YIMBYs.
Yes. Can you define the term YIMBY one time for our listeners who might not be familiar?
For sure. So white YIMBYs are people who are like, yes, in my backyard, which means like they are pro-development. And the only flaw behind that is that they are pro any development, not development that serves the people who need it most. Yeah. And so a lot of times you'll hear them say, like, we just need more housing, and that's going to solve everything, right? That's going to solve generations of racial discrimination in our housing system. That's going to solve the fact that there is a huge imbalance in landlord tenant power. Like, they just kind of assume that building more is going to solve our housing crisis. And they were really spewing the oppositions, whether or not they had the intention to, they really aligned themselves with the $4 million of opposition to say, oh, rent control is just going to hurt development. And they have a really flawed analysis of race and power in our housing system.
Certainly.
They don't see or appreciate or even recognize the lived experience and expertise and power of organizing. And they very much see our housing system as one where, you just need to let the market be free, because that's what's going to solve it. And so they were constantly coming out and being like, well, these people have good intentions and I support the idea of it, but blah, blah, blah. And it was just like, don't even tell me that you appreciate me as a leader. Don't even tell me that you appreciate our work door knocking if you're just going to sit on your laptop writing blogs about how you think you're better than everyone.
Facts. That's one of the reasons why your victory was so gratifying, is because I was seeing those blogs, and those Yimbys are my arch nemesis, really. You know what I'm saying? So to see y'all put the footwork in and not let them dominate the conversation and really show what housing justice looks like, that's just like a real sweet victory. Monica or B, do you have any, challenges or lessons that you think are instructive for listeners?
I would echo what Tram has said and B as well. I think for us, one of the kind of unique challenges too, is that as far as like traditional campaigns go, you want to have a narrative, like you want to have like a narrative. We're in a tech world. You want to be able to get things out, like technology wise. You want to be able to access a van on your phone while you're knocking, right? But at some point in our neighborhood, we realized, we're gonna have to throw this out. We're gonna have to put this on pause, and we're just gonna have to like do old school turf cuts, and we're gonna have to just go out here with our maps and take a look at like where are the populations that we actually can build solidarity and power during this campaign and after this campaign.
Hell yeah.
And so for us, it took a minute to get there, and that was frustrating and challenging, because I think maybe if we had started with that analysis early on, but in either case, that was a challenge. And I think the other thing for us that's unique is we're also one of the district planning councils in the city of St. Paul. So there was always caution around constituents or residents about lobbying and advocacy as a district council and a 501c3. And we hold a contract with the city of St. Paul. And so, just being really clear and also like super cautious and ahead of the game as far as like how we're going to operate, how we're going to do this. So making sure that, we had all of our I's dotted and our T's crossed, right? Like, so that nobody could mess with us. And so that was challenging too. Gives me lots of things to think about for the future with our contracts.
And I don't know if we define for people, WESCO is the West Side Community Organization. You're on the west side of St. Paul.
That's right.
Right on.
So we're a little bit isolated from the rest of the city. You have to cross the bridges to get to us.
Yeah. A beautiful area, all those beautiful hills and just beautiful culture. Yeah.
So, but I would say that's been a challenge for us.
Great. Thank you. B, do you got anything?
I think some challenges that we faced were also put up by the city as a whole, of like, oh, you need to collect signatures. Oh, but it needs to be on legal size paper in order to collect the signature. And it has to be a St. Paul resident in order to have a valid signature. And so I think we had to deal with those barriers of like these ridiculous regulations that St. Paul puts up. And it's like, also, I don't know, it still leaves out a lot of community members as well, and that's kind of the one thing that the campaign, loved it, but it's when it comes to voting and we have to do voting or electoral politics, it still leaves out a lot of the community. So
Yeah.
I think a lesson for me to learn as well is like, how do we still connect with the folks who can't necessarily participate in that electoral system? And it's something that we all talked about, right? Especially in steering committee, we took a lot of time to make sure that we still address that issue. We can't really skirt around it and be like, well, we'll figure it out when we figure it out. We really took the time to figure out, okay, how are we still going to talk to folks who might not be able to participate in the system, but might be affected by this issue as a whole? And I mean, we still did it. We were door knocking, like Monica said, every door. And like I said, the West Side did a lot of good work talking to a lot of people still. So I think we were still able to, talk to every single person, but it was definitely a more, for me personally, like a value struggle that I went through of like the electoral system, and it leaves out people. So I think I had to kind of overcome that. And I think as a steering committee, we did a great job of overcoming it together too. So if anything, we had a lot of struggles, but I think as a steering committee, we were able to really just have those hard conversations because you kind of have to, otherwise your values start to kind of be compromised a little bit. So it's like have those conversations and do it as a family, as a collective, because I think that's what we are in the steering committee. So
that's really affirming to hear. I had some of those same tensions myself in the way I participated. I was, knocking for rent control and working on a candidate's campaign in Minneapolis. And as a socialist, I recognize the inherent limitations in moving through our system, but also to not let that be an easy cop out to not participate, but to really try to put this type of a campaign inside of a broader working class movement that doesn't leave anybody out. And it sounds like you all really set the example for how to do that. I just wanted to clarify for listeners, folks might know, but you've kind of hinted to it. This campaign won several victories because first you had to collect the amount of signatures in order to get this onto the ballot with all the red tape and bureaucracy that entails. And then once it was on the ballot, then you had to mobilize people to vote and win. So this is like a marathon, and that's really incredible. So you won on November 2nd. And I'm already starting to see opposition and efforts to try to water down your proposal. Like what we know is that this struggle is a part of a broader class struggle. It doesn't end just with one victory. You all won one battle, but the larger war continues. So can you talk about what's happening now? How are the landlords and how are their representatives trying to attack your victory? And how can listeners show up to support you all to make sure we defend the space that you all won?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing the opposition do is really run through the Trump playbook, right? They are undermining the credibility of the election, right? I mean, they're not saying that, people who shouldn't have voted, but they're basically saying like, oh, voters didn't actually know what they were voting on. They're saying voters were too stupid and, voted for this idea with good intentions, but they're actually going to do a lot of damage. And they just didn't know better.
Right. Those silly renters.
Yeah. Which when we think about which wards it won is an incredibly racist rhetoric to be using.
Absolutely.
Right? Who showed up to vote? The 6 out of 7 wards are the most racially and economically diverse wards of the city. And then they're also, positioning themselves as the victim right now, right? They're like, oh, we're not going to be able to do this and that, and they're trying to fulfill that like disaster narrative prophecy that they warned us about.
Yeah.
And making it seem like it's not their choices that create the disaster narrative they warned about, because they have so much power in this market. And for once in a generation, they are finally seeing some limitations being placed on them. It's why they always called it like the strictest policy, right? It's a matter of perspective. If you have never been regulated in this city, then sure, you'll think of a regulation as strict. But when you're a renter who has never received protections, you will see this as a strong and progressive policy.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So, they are positioning themselves as the victim, but also using their power to make it look like they are the victim, and then really preventing us from uplifting our community victory, because this is a citywide victory, right? It's HENS, but it's also the voters, the over 30,000 voters of St. Paul who voted yes on this.
Wow.
And if you've noticed the press coverage, it has been very much, oh no, the panic. There is no talk about what was accomplished, the movement that was built across the city. And obviously we're working on that. We want to continue the celebration because, even like a month or two or 5 or 6 after election day, we have to remind people what we did together. And we can't let the media, we can't let the opposition, and we can't even let our elected leaders forget that, because they are accountable to voters at the end of the day. And even if they voted no or disagreed on this ordinance, at the end of the day, that was just one vote. And they took an oath to be accountable to the people in their wards. And their wards, 6 out of 7, decided that they wanted this ordinance. So our job in the next year is really to protect this ordinance and make sure that it gets implemented the way that the people voted on it. Because the people didn't vote on the idea of it, right? They voted on a very specific policy. And because we had real conversations with people, we were actually able to talk to them about those specific pieces of the policy. It wasn't just like, do good for renters, vote yes. It was like, it's a 3%. With no vacancy decontrol, with no exemptions for new construction. People knew exactly what they were voting for. And we got to make sure the city doesn't try to water any of that down. We have a call to action on our Twitter. So if you follow at HENS TP, HENSTP, then you'll see kind of a call to action that we put out. And yeah, you can follow us there. That's where we post a lot of our action items.
Awesome. Anything you want to add?
We've been having a lot of discussion around this, right? And I would say in one of our conversations, Margaret Kaplan, who's the executive director of the Housing Justice Center, and also, major part of this campaign and coalition, I think she said it best when we were having this discussion with all this pushback and the confusion, literally the chaos creation that the city has already started with from go, where it's not implemented now. Oh, it is implemented now. Oh, we don't know. Like that came from them. We were clear on this ballot initiative. We knew that it was going to take time for implementation. We knew that was going to be a while. So that chaos creation started there. But the people of St. Paul are smart. And this is what she said, right? And we all agreed, right? We're smart people. We were provided a lot of information, and we won. They lost. They poured millions of dollars into it. They lost. And now it's time to end this disaster narrative and start implementing the policies, because the voices of the people will hold this accountable. This is what was voted for. So I think that just knowing that's where we are today, and regardless of what they're trying to do, we need to have discussions with the coalition. We have to have discussions with the people before you try to change something that doesn't even need to be changed. One thing I will say is that as Wesco, we implemented the equitable development scorecard a few years back, and we interface with developers often. And new development. And we're obtaining long-term deep affordability commitments, 20, 30 years. It is not impossible for new builds to live into deep affordable price points. And so don't tell us that that's something that's going to, it's not true.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, I think what you all did is really shown that the standard narrative that we get in our media and that comes from our government institutions is a landlord narrative that assumes that the rules of the capitalist market are the rules of nature. And you all are proving that that's not true at all, and there's so many racist, classist assumptions in the way that business goes down, and you all mobilizing voters to turn out, I think is really helping people see through that. So not only is it providing material benefits for people to be able to stay in their home, I think it's also rising our collective consciousness and our collective expectations, So I just I can't say enough how much I admire the work that you all did. Is there anything else? I think this is a great, really informative conversation. Is there anything else you all want to add for our listeners before we sign off?
I was just thinking of some highlights from election night
that
I wanted to share, because I think it really points to how every conversation matters. We during election night, as the results were pulling in, we had this big map of all the wards and precincts, and we were like, oh, this person door knocked here, and holy crap, 70% of people voted yes. And it was being able to trace to really appreciate people for the work they did. And I feel like that's such an important piece of this, is helping people see exactly the through line of their efforts to door knock those hours to the victory. And one highlight for me was someone, one of our volunteers who like before they came to the watch party, they basically were like, oh, I'm gonna like go talk to more people. And they talked to 2 people who were like, oh yeah, I'm supportive. And he was like, well, are you gonna go vote? And they're like, yeah, maybe. And he was like, no, you gotta go vote. Like, this is your polling location. Like, I'm dragging you out to the polls. And then later we looked at those precinct results. It won by literally 1 vote.
That is incredible. Yeah, it really is. That goes to show everybody listening, you know what I'm saying? It almost sounds corny, but it's like it really, every conversation matters. Showing up really matters. It's hard to knock on doors. You know, I got butterflies in my stomach before I went to go knock doors, but it's gratifying and satisfying, you know, and it really, really does make a difference. That's so awesome to hear. I was, you know, around people on election day and people talking about their various predictions. And I'm not gonna lie, there are some people speaking pretty pessimistically about St. Paul, you know, and I just had my fingers crossed behind my back thinking like, nah, they're about to turn out. You know what I'm saying? So when I seen them results come back, I was really overjoyed. That was so cool to see.
I'm now getting excited just in this conversation again, right? It's just that, but it's true. In the beginning, years ago, we tried to do this or start talking about it, and folks were like, "It's not winnable. It's not something that's going to be winnable, right?" And then came back with this coalition, right, of like-minded, value-driven, people, and we started this, right. But all along the way, folks are saying it's not winnable. It's too short. It's a pandemic. How are you going to get out on the doors and have people sign signatures, right? Like, you think somebody's going to open the door and take your pen in their hand and sign the signature? And so against all those odds, it was just the naysayers, right? And it was just keep pushing. So I really appreciate just that little bit of recollection that you had, the reflection there. Same thing too, I'm going to shout out Lauren. She was a volunteer who was on the doors. And that night too, the night of election, literally was driving to the hub where we were, and I almost hit her. It was so dark, and she the doors, and she says, and I was like, aren't you coming in? Aren't you coming in? And she's like, I just have a couple more doors. I've been knocking. People are getting off of work. It's dark, and they're like, oh, I have to get dinner or whatever. And she's like, you have time still. They're open till 8. And so it was just the very last minute, and people still didn't know. People still were like, oh yeah, it's election, right? And they still went to the last minute. So all the naysayers just keep pushing.
Yeah. That really resonates with me because, like I said, Tram and I have been talking about rent control for some years together, and there's always naysayers, and it's not the institutional politics. People who are comfortable in own homes, they're happy to just go tinkering at the edges of things. But you all really, I feel like in a very St. Paul fashion, stood up, hard nosed, fighting for the blue collar, for the poor, and for the working class, and went against the logic of just go along to get along, and really, got it out the mud. That's like so inspiring. B, do you got any last thoughts for us?
I would say, really, when you want to organize something so big, it's always important to know who you're organizing with. So again, it's like a huge shout out to the steering committee, a huge shout out to Tram, who really led the whole campaign so beautifully. So it's like, going into it, I was like, I need to make sure that this is something I truly align with, and that the folks who are involved are aligned with as well. And it's like, we can't really, excuse my language, we can't really fuck around here. We don't really have time. Like, we need to make sure that that these group of folks that is going to work on it are going to work on it, and that we're going to, no matter how hard it can be, because it was hard. There were a couple of times where I was like, oh my God, I am so tired. But it's like, it's that energy that you get from other people that really will help you keep going. And I think that's what kind of helped me keep going, was the energy of the steering committee, the energy of the ground game committee, everyone just being so determined and so ready to kind of fight back against the landlord lobby, but also fighting for their communities. Because, we're all a part of these communities, and it's like, this is personal. It's not just something that we want to, put on our resume or like get clout from. It's something that is personal to us. It's going to affect us and our people and people like us. So I will say that, make sure that when you are organizing with such a large issue, you are organizing with the right people. Because I know I did, and it felt really good. And I think that was a major victory in itself too. So
absolutely.
Yeah, I think I also want to uplift for anyone who's going to run a campaign in the future, you don't have to run the traditional institutional campaign, because we didn't, right? I have never managed a campaign in my life. I'm a housing nerd. And I ended up managing this campaign. But that allowed us to answer a lot of difficult questions, right? Also, like there are so many instances where people were, or even we questioned ourselves, thinking like, oh, like, gosh, we probably need like a field director, or like, oh, we don't know how to use these tools. And we learned how to use the tools that campaigns use, but you don't necessarily have to use them in the same way, right? Because we used Van to knock doors. Then we also were like, renters don't show up in Van. That's not a good way to connect with renters, right? So a lot of our door knocking towards the end was just take this turf, forget Van, because it's going to focus on homeowners. It's going to focus on people who've come out to vote every year. And that's not our target audience. There are also so many examples of where, like, I think in typical campaign fashion, people would have been like, oh, you need to pivot your messaging to address this talking point, or like, you need to, address these really specific questions. We were like, no, we're actually not going to get lost in these nitty-gritty details where people are trying to trap us, right? We're going to get into the nitty-gritty details with voters on the doors when we're having conversations, real conversations where people want to learn, but we're not going to be, leaving behind our core messaging about who this matters for and why this matters in larger like media settings. So I think we had a lot of discipline, and there were times where we questioned ourselves, right? But we got to trust your gut, because the way that campaigns have been run in the past is not the way that campaigns have to be run in the future.
I just want to echo that, because as somebody who comes from a working class background, I don't come from like a political family. I got politicized from real life struggle. I start to glaze over and want to leave when it's like the typical campaign people who went and studied, and everybody's tells you why you can't tell the truth and why you got to pitch your message to some 6-year-old white person. That turns our people off, but a campaign that's full of heart, that's full of culture, that's full of principle, that really has the people rooted, that's what brings people in. So, and I want to say that message discipline really resonated, because I was tuning in, you know what I'm saying? And I heard you, Tram, out there, and I seen you slip those traps and really stay principled. And I was just so proud, So I want to say, let's keep this flame lit. St. Paul's the first step. We need statewide rent control. We need rent control across the country. We need to turn this into a battle for public housing, to really enshrine housing as a human right for working class people. I want to shout out the Midway. I want to shout out Frogtown. I want to shout out Rondo, the North End, the East Side, the West Side. Selby, you know what I'm saying? Everybody in St. Paul who put in work, and I definitely want to show my appreciation and respect. It's a real honor to have you, Monica, B, Tram. Thank you so much for joining us. Everybody get out there and celebrate and keep up the fight for rent control in St. Paul. Thanks for tuning in. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans about as far as they can see to keep them coming. Bands building up the